Singapore's mulling a new law to safeguard businesses that are deemed critical to national security. This would mean more control over who can buy or manage these companies and letting the government know if ownership changes hands. Our colleague Michelle Teo joins me now for more. Michelle, now, not a lot of detail there. What more can you tell us about these proposed changes?
Well, to be quite honest, the details are quite scant because of two main reasons. Firstly, that it concerns national security, and secondly, simply because MTI says it would be premature to list any designated entity since the bill has not even been tabled in Parliament yet. But some of the key features that we can see in the bill really pertain to what's being called designated entities. And there are a couple of key features here. So the first is about ownership and control. So companies, for example, that wish to sell above 50%, these designated entities that wish to sell above 50% of their shares will need to get the minister's consent. And it's the same if a buyer wants to invest into these companies above 12, 25, 50%, they'll need to get approval. Now, if that approval is not being sought, then that transaction can be considered void. Same consent needs to be given for companies to appoint key officers, for example, their CEOs and their directors. The second slide really pertains to remedial directions that could be taken if such approval is not being sought. Remedial directions, for example, having a certain person dispose of their equity interests, which include shares. And the second, which is probably a lot more critical, is that the government will have what's called step-in rights, where it can take over control. It can take control of a company if the company is deemed to have contravened national security.
So what we do know so far is who is considered a designated entity, the kinds of remedial actions you just mentioned that can be taken, and step-in rights. We might also know something about the scope of the application of these proposed changes.
Well, if we think about it, it's really about, let's imagine a case where there's a hypothetical company, where a shareholder leaks information and millions or data of millions of Singaporeans is being compromised. Now that constitutes a national security issue. So what this bill would do is it would give the government a reason to then step in and intervene if there should be a case to do so. Now, there's no cause for concern now, but it does provide that safeguard. And it's not just local entities, but let's say a foreign entity like an MNC that has contravened national security issues. That is a bill that can help us to arrest it there and then.
Because national security is something every country, every policymaker is concerned with at every point in time. But is there any reason to suspect, any reason to think, why is it being done now as opposed to next year, or why did it not happen last year, hypothetically?
Well, of late, there have been quite a couple of countries that have come up with their own investment management regimes. And to be quite honest, I don't think these are very new in Singapore. We do have existing regulations that cover the various sectors. Banking, for example, telecommunications, utilities, they all have what's being called sectoral legislations, which do have ownership and control rights. So these things aren't exactly very new, but the difference for this bill is that it covers companies that weren't previously covered in existing sectoral legislations. Now, we spoke with MTI Minister Gan Kim Yong earlier, and he shared that this is essential to beef up national security.
Because of the increasingly complex economic environment, it is important for us to take a broader view on how we can effectively manage the risks that may arise from some of these critical entities. They may be governed from the point of view of licensing regulation or contracting conditions, but in a situation where an emergency crisis that may arise, it may not be adequate for us to be able to ensure their continuity.
You mentioned earlier a specific case in which a government might step, or this proposed change might kick in. So, for example, the loss of private data. But how does the government decide what kinds of business or entities would be, by their very nature, critical to national security?
the short answer is we don't know, because there aren't many details revealed at this point. But let's take a case, for example, Pacific International Lines. It's a major shipping company, but before I go any further, I need to first say that I do not know that if PIL will be a designated entity, nor am I suggesting that it should be. But it is a case where it is a major company with deep linkages connecting Singapore to the rest of the world. And if something were to go wrong there, then that would be something that would affect Singapore directly. And something did almost go very wrong. For example, 2 years ago in 2021, PIL was in a debt position of over $3 billion. And then it went through a restructuring plan, it sold some ships, it cut routes. Ultimately, that plan was approved by Heliconia Capital Management, which is under Temasek. And today, PIL is profitable. It's reversed its fortunes. It made a $3 billion profit last year. But what if that restructuring plan didn't happen? That would then give the government a case to intervene and step in to ensure smooth running of functions. Now, this exact case was something that my colleague and I had brought up earlier with Benjamin Tan, who's the head for the Centre of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And he says that for Singapore, it could very well be, depending on the situation, whether or not the state comes in to intervene.
It comes down to really whether the potential failure of any company would be a national security question, because there may be other companies that can step in into that, fill that void. But if any particular entity is so important in the particular service that it provides or products that it provides, that and important to the nation in terms of security, whether it's public health or economic stability or the law and order, then that's probably the time when this law would be put into place.
All right, Michelle, so we've been talking academically about potential national security issues, companies involved in actions that might actually threaten that. But at the end of the day, to use that old cliche, it comes back down to what each one of us does in our everyday lives. How does this change, proposed change, how might it affect you and me in our ordinary daily lives and ordinary daily businesses?
Well, if you think about it, the landscape of threats is evolving. That's the very premise of this. And economic threats aren't always physical threats, and sometimes they could be have a wider impact. So we need to look at this bill for Singaporeans. Ultimately, this is really about beefing up our national security, especially when it comes to protecting us financially. Now, for businesses, there could be some short-term adjustment costs, which could then impact business competitiveness. But the Singapore Business Federation says that that might not really be the case, because companies or investors who want to come to Singapore could have increased consumer confidence, because they know that critical entities will continue running no matter what happens.
We hope in the implementation, the government will continue to take a consultative approach, perhaps provide some clear timeline on how long they will take to revert back to businesses upon query, share a little bit more about the criteria before they designate a company, be consultative in understanding the concerns of the companies, and then more importantly, have a certain process that is clear in terms of the review. By doing that, I think companies will have some certainty.
Well, thanks so much for joining us this evening, Michelle, for that candid and very clear explanation of what we can expect from this proposed change. Thank you.